Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It'll never not be hilarious referring to this movie as the final chapter. This is a franchise that is 12 movies long, and the fourth movie is not even the halfway point of this series, the final chapter. Oh god. So the last video I did for this channel was talking about Halloween 2, which was a follow-up video I did the previous year, the last Spooktober, where I talked about Halloween 4, and today I'm going to be doing something similar. Last year I talked about my personal favorite Friday the 13th movie, Jason Lives, and today I'm going to be talking about my second favorite Friday the 13th movie, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. So the reason these two are my favorite Friday the 13th movies, I mean, it's pretty simple. A large part of it can be boiled down to entertainment value. As a whole, this franchise is not that great. Even the first movie is not that good. And that's one of the reasons why Friday the 13th kind of stands out in a way from other horror movie franchises. When you look at other horror movies that spawned on long-running franchises, movies like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Exorcist, Jaws. The common consensus for most of those movies, maybe not all of them, but for most of them, it's like, oh, the first one is definitely the best movie. And the other movies get increasingly dumber and more silly. Friday the 13th is different in that even most fans agree the first one really isn't even that good. I mean, the first movie is openly, very openly, a Halloween ripoff film. And it should be noted that Halloween, although that movie came out before Friday the 13th, and it definitely laid the blueprint for American slasher horror movies, Friday the 13th is the reason why the slasher boom took off. And most slasher movies that are ripping off other slasher movies, they're ripping off from Friday the 13th. I mean, look no further than movies that came out the very next year, like The Burning and Sleepaway Camp, for example. Those are camp-based slasher movies that are taking direct inspiration, if you will, from the first Friday the 13th movie. So the Friday the 13th, the first movie, that's the movie that should be credited for essentially creating the slasher boom, because when the movie came out, it was pretty much panned by critics because, let's face it, it's really not that good of a movie. That's my opinion. And then we get to Friday the 13th Part 2, which, that's another fan favorite. I still don't love it as much as a lot of other fans do. I still think it's kind of boring, but it's definitely more entertaining than the first Friday the 13th movie, and definitely more entertaining than Part 3 in 3D. I think that's probably one of the most boring horror movies I've ever seen. It's just so sluggish and dull and stupid, and I do not like Friday the 13th Part 3 at all. Even though that's the one where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask. But by the time we get to Part 4, it's the first film in the series, in my opinion, that's like, okay, now the series, it took you 4 fucking movies to finally hit your stride. You finally realize what your greatest strengths are. The pacing is so much better in Part 4 than the previous movies. The kills are so much better because Tom Savini came back. Right from the first kill of this movie where that guy gets a fucking hacksaw to the neck and his head twisted all the way around. It's like, ooh. So the kills are actually more daring and kind of grisly than they were before. We actually get some characters that are more memorable, at least in comparison to previous characters. Like, we have the whole Jarvis family, and of course this is the movie that introduces the most important character in the Friday the 13th franchise, Tommy Jarvis, played by Corey Feldman, and then he's played by another actor in Part 5, and then he's played yet by another actor in Part 6. The continuity in these movies are excellent. And then one of the other big highlights in Friday the 13th Part 4 is Crispin Glover. And that's because, A, it's Crispin Glover and he's recognizable because, Back to the Future and all the other stuff he'd go on to do after this movie. But his performance in this movie is so weird and so memorable. Hey, Ted, where the hell's the corkscrew?
Hey, Ted, where the hell's the corkscrew? I mean, can you figure that? What the fuck happened? God, I'm horny.
Just the way he delivers lines, the dance sequence, of course. I mean, amongst Friday the 13th fans, it's one of the most iconic moments in the series. So there's all these quirky, weird little moments in the movie that stand out, that makes it more memorable. And it's just flat out more entertaining as a whole. And it's probably the best representation of the Friday the 13th franchise as a whole. It's kind of the quintessential Friday the 13th movie. And I'd go as far as to say it's kind of the quintessential 80s slasher movie as a whole. I mean, if someone was getting into this franchise for the first time, I would actually make the argument, I'm like, you know what? I wouldn't start with the first movie because it's not really the best representation of what this franchise is. When you think of Friday the 13th, you think of Jason, you think of a hockey mask, and you think of creative and fun deaths. Part 4 is the best representation of that, because after Part 4, later on in the movies, especially when we get to movies like Part 7 and Part 8 in particular, the MPAA would really crack down on the violence in those movies to the point where it feels like it's edited for TV. I mean, it might as well be.
You had mentioned before, like, the MPAA just cut out all the gruesome...
Oh, yeah,
like,
they
this
trimmed
feels
everything.
like... I felt like I was watching a TV edit.
Eddie.
Yeah, 6 and especially 7. That's the worst.
Yeah.
And we start seeing that in Part 6, which is really a shame, because that's why you go to these movies, is to see fun, creative kills. But Friday the 13th Part 4 is kind of like the perfect 80s slasher movie. It's perfect and imperfect in all the ways that kind of, make slasher movies fun to watch. I mean, you got cliched characters, the ones that are the most promiscuous and smoking dope, they're the ones that get killed brutally. There's the final girl. There's the fake out scares. There's all the ingredients that make a good slasher movie, or at least a competent slasher movie, that's featured in this movie. And that's why it's my second favorite Friday the 13th movie, because the reason I love Jason Lives so much, outside of the fact that it feels more like a movie in terms of the story, in terms of the visual language. It's much more ambitious, much more cinematic looking. Like, I like the way Part 4 is shot, but it's very, it's very standard slasher stuff. Part 6 would really double down on the atmosphere and actually make Jason more of a mythical figure. In a way that I think is a lot of fun. And it's also the first Friday the 13th movie, and one of the first slasher movies ever, to be somewhat self-aware, to kind of wink at the audience a little bit and be meta years before Scream would ever become a thing. And that makes that movie more enjoyable to me. But I will say, where Jason Lives lacks is the kills. And that's where Part 4 comes in. So whenever Friday the 13th comes around, the once a year it does, those are the two movies I end up going to the most, because I get the best of both worlds. When I watch Part 4, I get the classic, most iconic Jason deaths in the series. I mean, and his death too is worth mentioning, where Corey Feldman, gets in his head psychologically and shaves his head to look like young Jason to distract him, to help his sister, and then he gets that machete to the face and he's sliding down on the machete. Fun, brutal, practical stuff. The movie delivers in all that aspect of it, but Jason Lives gives me just an energy. It's the most exciting of all the Friday the 13th movies. It's the most energetic. It's the one that feels the most urgent. It's the one that feels like it actually has a plot going on, because when you look at Part 4, similar to Halloween 2, which I talked about, this movie doesn't have a plot, because both Friday the 13th Part 2 and Friday the 13th Part 3, they both pick up right where the previous movie left off. So it's hilarious to think about, but Friday the 13th Part 4 takes place just a few days after Friday the 13th Part 2. And Part 2 came out in 1981. Part 4 came out in 1984. So there's a big gap there. And similar to those movies, Jason is just wandering around, killing people. And we get some character stuff here and there. There might be some elements where the movie's trying to expand on the lore a little bit of Jason, just barely. But for the most part, it's just Jason walking around, killing people, till we get to the end, and then Jason's mask gets exposed, and then he, in this case, gets killed until he gets resurrected in Part 6. But there's not that much of a plot in this movie, which is fine. That's kind of, once again, that kind of is classic slasher stuff, where the plot is not really why you watch these movies. You watch it for the kills and the tension and, seeing the POV shots with the killer sneaking up on people. But even in the case of most 80s slasher movies, a lot of that can be very dull, and the kills can be very oh, that was boring. Part 4 delivers, because my boy Tom Savini comes back and he really gets quite creative. And that's what makes this movie such a fan favorite in the series as a whole. But I enjoy the other movies, in their own way. But the two ones that stand out the most is Part 4 and Part 6. And Part 4 is the movie that I would give to somebody who is interested in Friday the 13th franchise but hasn't seen any of the movies, and is maybe just interested in slasher movies in general. If you want to know what's a good starting point, just jump in with Friday the 13th Part 4. It gives you the backstory in the first 5 minutes, and you don't really need to watch the movie for the story in general. I mean, you just watch it for Jason killing people, and that's what this movie is, and that's what makes it fun, and it embodies every single cliche that you would want to see in a fun way in a slasher movie. So that's my thoughts on Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It's definitely a guilty pleasure. I enjoy this movie quite a bit, even though I can acknowledge that it's quite stupid. But it's just flat out entertaining. But I want to hear your thoughts on these movies. What's your favorite Friday the 13th movie? Is it part 4? Is it part 6? Is it a different film in the series? Mention it in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.